The rain pounded against the windows of the maintenance bay as Technical Sergeant Rebecca Chen wiped grease from her hands. At 34, she had the focused eyes of someone who'd spent years solving complex problems, and hands that bore the small scars and calluses of a lifetime working with military hardware. "That should do it," she muttered, closing the access panel on the M121 mortar system. The 120 heavy mortar was the backbone of her unit's indirect fire support, and this particular one had been giving the operators trouble for weeks. "You sure about that, Chen?" Staff Sergeant Wilson leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "That's what Ramirez said last week, and it jammed up again during the exercise." Rebecca glanced up, her expression neutral despite the implied criticism. "With respect, Sergeant, Ramirez didn't check the recoil buffer assembly. There was metal fatigue in the primary spring. I've replaced it and recalibrated the entire firing mechanism." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "If you say so, just make sure it works for tomorrow's demonstration. Colonel Hayes and some brass from Washington will be watching." "It'll work," Rebecca assured him, though Wilson had already turned to leave. When the door closed, she sighed and returned to her work. Fort Sill, Oklahoma might be the home of U.S. Army artillery, but it wasn't always a welcoming place for a female Asian-American ordnance specialist. Despite 12 years of service and expertise that had earned her a reputation in some circles, Rebecca still found herself having to prove her competence daily. She ran her hand along the mortar's barrel, feeling for imperfections invisible to the eye. Her grandfather had taught her that technique. He'd been a gunsmith back in Taiwan before immigrating to America. "The hands know what the eyes cannot see," he would say. The motor pool door opened again, bringing with it the smell of rain and a blast of humid air. Master Sergeant Paul Donovan, her direct supervisor and one of the few people at Fort Sill who fully appreciated her skills, stepped inside. "Still at it, Chen? It's nearly 2100 hours." Rebecca straightened up. "Just finished, Master Sergeant. Had to replace the recoil buffer assembly." Donovan approached, examining her work with an expert eye. "Good catch. Most would have missed that." He glanced at her toolbox, nodding the specialized instruments she'd brought from home. "Using the family tools again, I see." "They're more precise than standard issue," Rebecca replied, a touch defensively. "Hey, no judgment here. Results are what matter." Donovan picked up a custom-made micrometer from her toolkit. "Your grandfather's." Rebecca nodded. "He made it himself, said the military spec ones were too coarse for fine work." "Smart man." Donovan handed it back carefully. "Listen, about tomorrow's demonstration, there's been a change of plans." Something in his tone made Rebecca pause. "What kind of change?" "The visiting brass. Turns out it's General Westmoreland and his entourage from the Rapid Deployment Task Force. They're evaluating new support systems for their units." Rebecca whistled softly. The RDTF was the Army's elite quick reaction force, first in for emergencies anywhere in the world. And Donovan continued, "They've upped the requirements for the demonstration. Instead of the standard firing rate of 4 rounds per minute, they want to see sustained fire at 6 to 8 rounds per minute." "That's not possible," Rebecca said immediately. "The M121 is rated for 4, maybe 5 rounds per minute maximum. Push it beyond that and you risk overheating, mechanical failure, or worse." "I know," Donovan rubbed his face tiredly. "But the order came down from Colonel Hayes himself. Apparently the RDTF is comparing our mortar systems with a new prototype from General Dynamics, if our current equipment can't match the fire rate they need for their operations." He didn't need to finish. Rebecca understood the implications. If the M121 couldn't meet the RDTF's requirements, the Army would spend millions on new systems, and Fort Sill's reputation as the premier artillery training center would suffer. "So what are we supposed to do? The laws of physics don't change because a general wants them to," Rebecca pointed out. "That's why I'm talking to you," Donovan said quietly. "If anyone can figure out how to safely push these systems beyond their specs, it's you, Chen." Rebecca frowned, considering the mortar system before her. "I'd need to modify the recoil system completely, reinforce the base plate, redesign the cooling system." She shook her head. "That's weeks of work, not hours." "What about," Donovan hesitated, then lowered his voice, "what about that method your grandfather used on the artillery pieces in Korea, the one you mentioned once?" Rebecca stiffened. That was different. Those were older systems, less complex. But the principle would be the same, wouldn't it? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Her grandfather had indeed developed a technique during his service in the Korean War, a method of modifying artillery systems to fire beyond their rated capacity during desperate situations. He'd taught it to her years ago, but she'd never used it. It violated multiple Army maintenance protocols and safety regulations. "It's too risky," she finally said. "My grandfather's method puts tremendous strain on the equipment. It was meant for emergency situations only, when you needed maximum firepower and didn't care if the gun was destroyed in the process. And if these mortars don't perform tomorrow, they'll be scrapped anyway," Donovan countered. "At least this way they have a chance to show what they can do." Rebecca closed her toolkit, buying time to think. What Donovan was suggesting could end her career if something went wrong. But if she did nothing, the unit would fail the demonstration regardless. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Donovan nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. "Whatever you decide, I'll back you up. But Chen," he added as he turned to leave, "these mortars are all that stand between our guys and whatever they might face out there. Sometimes the rulebook has to take second place to the mission." After he left, Rebecca remained in the quiet maintenance bay, the rain drumming steadily on the metal roof. She opened a small, worn leather case hidden in the bottom of her toolkit. Inside were specialized tools her grandfather had crafted, tools designed specifically for modifications the Army would never authorize. She ran her fingers over them, remembering her grandfather's words. "These are for when lives matter more than regulations." Rebecca checked her watch. The demonstration was scheduled for 900 hours tomorrow. If she was going to attempt her grandfather's modification, she would need the entire night. She took out her phone and pulled up a rarely viewed photo. Her grandfather in his Army uniform, standing beside an artillery piece in Korea. The date stamp read 1952. Around him were American soldiers, exhausted but alive because that artillery had held off waves of enemy forces, firing at nearly twice its rated capacity thanks to one man's forbidden knowledge. Making her decision, Rebecca tucked the photo away and reached for the specialized tools. She had work to do and very little time. Outside, the storm intensified, as if nature itself was reflecting the turmoil of what she was about to attempt. The maintenance bay was eerily quiet at 200 hours, illuminated only by Rebecca's work lights and the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. She had been working steadily for hours, her movements precise despite fatigue beginning to set in. "All right, Grandpa," she murmured to herself, "let's see if your trick still works." The M121 mortar system lay partially disassembled before her. Rebecca had removed the standard recoil mechanism and was now carefully installing a modified version she'd fabricated using components from her grandfather's kit, combined with parts she'd machined herself. The essence of her grandfather's technique involved three key modifications: a redesigned recoil system that could absorb greater shock, a reinforced base plate to prevent shifting during rapid fire, and a specialized cooling system to prevent the barrel from overheating. None of these modifications appeared in any Army technical manual. In fact, several directly contradicted established maintenance protocols. But Rebecca's grandfather had developed them during the desperate fighting at the Pusan perimeter, where his artillery battery had been forced to hold off waves of North Korean attacks with limited resources. The door to the maintenance bay opened suddenly, startling Rebecca. She instinctively moved to cover her work, but relaxed when she saw it was only Specialist Jackson, a young mortar operator from the demonstration team. "Sergeant Chen, what are you still doing here?" Jackson asked, shaking rain from his uniform. "I just came to check if you'd fixed our problem child." He nodded toward the mortar. Rebecca hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Jackson was a good soldier, competent, dedicated, and not prone to unnecessarily by-the-book thinking. "I'm making some adjustments," she said carefully, "for tomorrow's demonstration." Jackson approached, his eyes widening as he saw the extent of the modifications. "Those definitely aren't standard." He picked up a component Rebecca had removed. "Isn't this the safety governor for the firing rate?" "It is," Rebecca admitted. "I'm replacing it with an enhanced version." "Enhanced?" Jackson looked skeptical. "The safety governor is there to prevent the system from firing too rapidly and damaging itself. Removing it violates about 6 different safety protocols. Rebecca straightened up, making a decision. Jackson, what's your background before the Army? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Mechanical engineering, 2 years at Georgia Tech before I enlisted. Why? Because I need someone who understands what I'm doing here. Someone who can help me finish before morning. She gestured to the mortar. Yes, I'm modifying the safety systems. Yes, it's against regulations. But tomorrow, they're expecting this mortar to fire at nearly twice its rated capacity, and if it can't, the whole unit looks bad. Jackson frowned. Why would they expect that? The M121 is rated for 4 rounds per minute, 5 max. Rebecca explained about the RDTF observers and the competing prototype system. As she spoke, she could see understanding dawn on Jackson's face. So we either modify these against regulations, or the Army spends millions replacing them with new systems that can meet the requirement, he summarized. Exactly. Jackson was silent for a moment, clearly weighing the implications. And you really think you can make this work? Rebecca nodded toward her grandfather's tools. My grandfather developed this technique during Korea. When their position was being overrun, his artillery pieces fired at almost double their rated capacity for 3 hours straight. They burned out afterward, but they saved hundreds of lives. And you think you can replicate that? With some improvements, Rebecca confirmed. Modern materials, better machining. The principle is the same, but the execution can be more refined. Jackson studied the modifications she'd already made, his engineering background allowing him to understand the logic behind them. The recoil system is clever, he admitted. Distributes the force more evenly. But what about heat buildup? Even with this modified system, the barrel will still overheat at sustained high firing rates. Rebecca smiled for the first time that night. That's where my grandfather's real trick comes in. She pulled a small metal case from her toolkit and opened it to reveal several specialized rings made of an unusual metal alloy. These go inside the barrel at specific intervals. They're heat sinks, made of a proprietary alloy my grandfather developed. Jackson took one, examining it with newfound respect. What's the composition? Family secret, Rebecca replied. But they absorb and distribute heat far more efficiently than standard materials. The Army tested similar concepts in the 90s, but abandoned them as too expensive for mass production. But your grandfather made these himself. Rebecca nodded. In his workshop, he was a metallurgist before becoming a gunsmith. Jackson handed the ring back carefully. So what do you need me to do? For the next 3 hours, Rebecca and Jackson worked together to complete the modifications. With Jackson's help, the work proceeded much faster. As an operator, he also provided insights from the user perspective that helped Rebecca refine several aspects of the design. By 5:30 hours, they were ready for a preliminary test. They had moved the mortar to a test firing position at the far end of the maintenance bay, reinforced with sandbags. This goes wrong, we're both facing court-martial, Jackson noted, though his tone suggested excitement rather than fear. If it goes right, no one will ever know we modified it, Rebecca countered. These changes are reversible. Once the demonstration is over, I can restore everything to factory spec. She inserted a dummy round into the mortar, one that would trigger the firing mechanism without actually launching a projectile. Ready? She asked, hand poised over the firing pin. Jackson nodded, clipboard ready to record results. Rebecca triggered the firing mechanism. The satisfying thunk of the system engaging echoed through the bay. Without pausing, she loaded another dummy round, then another, and another. They achieved 7 rounds in 1 minute, well beyond the system's rated capacity. The modified recoil system handled the stress beautifully, and temperature readings from the barrel showed the heat sinks working exactly as intended. It works, Jackson said, amazement evident in his voice. It actually works. Rebecca allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before beginning the process of cleaning up. We need to prepare the other 3 mortars the same way. The demonstration calls for a 4-gun battery. That's barely 3 hours of work, Jackson calculated, and we'll need help. We can't risk bringing anyone else in on this, Rebecca started to say, but was interrupted by the maintenance bay door opening once again. This time it was Master Sergeant Donovan, accompanied by 2 other mortar technicians, specialists Rivera and Thompson. Thought you might need some help, Donovan said, taking in the modified mortar and the components spread across the workbench. These two know how to keep quiet, and they're good with their hands. Rebecca exchanged glances with Jackson, then nodded. We've got 3 more systems to modify before the demonstration. I'll show you what to do. As dawn broke over Fort Sill, the small team worked feverishly to replicate Rebecca's modifications on the remaining mortars. By 7:30, all 4 systems were ready, looking externally identical to standard M121 mortars, but internally transformed by Rebecca's forbidden techniques. Remember, she instructed the others as they prepared to transport the mortars to the demonstration range. Not a word about these modifications. As far as anyone knows, these are standard systems with basic maintenance performed. Everyone nodded in agreement. What they had done could end careers if discovered, but they all understood the stakes, both for their unit and potentially for soldiers who would rely on these weapons in the field. As they loaded the mortars onto transport vehicles, Rebecca felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Her grandfather's techniques had proven effective in testing, but the real proof would come during the demonstration, with General Westmoreland and Colonel Hayes watching. The morning sun broke through the clouds as they drove toward the range, the storm having passed during the night. Whether that was a good omen or simply a calm before another storm would soon be revealed. The demonstration range buzzed with activity as Rebecca and her team positioned the 4 modified mortars. Officers in pressed uniforms clustered near a covered observation area, their attention currently focused on a sleek, next-generation mortar system displayed by representatives from General Dynamics. That's our competition, Donovan muttered, nodding toward the new system. Supposedly fires 10 rounds per minute, computer-assisted targeting, half the weight of our M121s. Rebecca studied the prototype. It was impressive, clearly the result of millions in R&D funding and years of development. By comparison, their decades-old M121s looked almost primitive, despite the internal modifications she'd made. Sergeant Chen, Colonel Hayes approached, his face a mask of professional courtesy that didn't quite hide the tension in his eyes. Everything ready for the demonstration. Yes, sir, Rebecca replied, standing at attention. All 4 mortar systems are prepared and operational. Hayes lowered his voice. I don't need to remind you how important this is. General Westmoreland isn't just evaluating these systems for the RDTF, he's making recommendations for the entire artillery modernization program. Understood, sir. Good, Hayes glanced at the mortar crews who were preparing for the demonstration. These men have been briefed on the enhanced performance requirements. Rebecca nodded. They understand what's expected, sir. What she didn't say was that Jackson had personally trained the mortar crews on subtle adjustments to their technique that would accommodate the modified systems. The crews hadn't been told about the modifications specifically, plausible deniability, but they understood they would be firing at rates beyond normal protocols. As Hayes walked away to greet the arriving general, Jackson moved beside Rebecca, nervous. Not about the mortars, she replied quietly. They'll perform. I'm more concerned about what happens afterward. Before Jackson could respond, a voice called over the loudspeaker. All personnel, demonstration will commence in 15 minutes. Mortar crews to your stations. The next quarter hour passed in a blur of final preparations. Rebecca checked each mortar one last time, making minute adjustments and quietly reassuring the crews. From the observation area, she could see General Westmoreland, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair, being given the sales pitch by the General Dynamics representatives. The general's face remained impassive, giving no indication of his thoughts. Finally, it was time. The demonstration would proceed in 3 phases. First, the M121 mortars would demonstrate standard performance. Then they would demonstrate enhanced performance, the accelerated firing rate. Finally, the General Dynamics prototype would show its capabilities. The first phase went flawlessly. The mortar crews executed textbook procedures, hitting targets with precision at the standard firing rate of 4 rounds per minute. Rebecca watched carefully, monitoring the systems for any signs of stress, but her regular maintenance had the mortars operating at peak efficiency. Then came the critical moment. Colonel Hayes stepped forward to address the observers. Now, gentlemen, will demonstrate the M121's capability for sustained rapid fire in emergency combat situations. While the technical manual specifies a maximum sustained rate of 4 rounds per minute, our crews have developed techniques to safely exceed this rate when operational needs demand it. This was a careful framing, suggesting that the enhanced performance came from crew technique rather than equipment modifications. Rebecca appreciated the colonel's wording, which wasn't technically a lie. "Mortar crews prepare for rapid-fire demonstration," Hayes ordered. The crews took their positions. Jackson, serving as fire direction controller, gave Rebecca a subtle nod. "Battery rapid-fire sequence, fire." What followed impressed even Rebecca, who knew exactly what modifications she had made. The 4 mortar crews operated with machine-like precision, dropping rounds into the tubes at a pace that should have been impossible for the M121 system. 6 rounds per minute, 7 rounds per minute, 8 rounds per minute. The impacts on the distant target area came in a near-continuous thunder, far more rapid than the standard firing rate. Through her binoculars, Rebecca could see the general and other officers leaning forward, clearly surprised by the performance they were witnessing. After 3 minutes of sustained rapid fire, a total of 24 rounds per mortar, double what should have been possible, Hayes called for ceasefire. Rebecca immediately moved among the mortars, checking for overheating or stress damage. To her immense relief, the systems had performed exactly as she'd hoped. The barrels were hot but well within safe parameters thanks to the heat sink rings. The modified recoil systems had prevented the base plates from shifting despite the increased firing rate. From the observation area, she could see animated discussion among the officers. General Westmoreland was asking questions, gesturing toward the mortar battery. The General Dynamics representatives looked distinctly uncomfortable. Colonel Hayes approached Rebecca, a hint of a smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "Outstanding performance, Sergeant. The General is impressed, wants to know how we achieved that rate of fire with obsolete equipment." "Just good maintenance, sir," Rebecca replied carefully, "and experienced crews." Hayes held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, suggesting he suspected there was more to it, but nodded. "Well, whatever you did, keep it up. The prototype's demonstration is next, but I think we've already made our point." The General Dynamics demonstration proceeded as expected. Their prototype was indeed impressive, achieving a sustained fire rate of 9 rounds per minute with computer-assisted targeting that increased accuracy. But the narrative had changed. Instead of showcasing a revolutionary new system against outdated equipment, they were now having to explain why the Army should spend millions on new mortars when the existing ones could apparently perform nearly as well with proper maintenance and training. As the demonstration concluded, Rebecca found herself unexpectedly summoned to join Colonel Hayes in speaking with General Westmoreland. "Sergeant Chen," Hayes introduced her, "our lead ordnance specialist. She's responsible for maintaining the mortar systems you just saw." General Westmoreland shook her hand firmly. "Impressive work, Sergeant. Those M121s performed well beyond specs. I've been using those systems for 20 years, and I've never seen them fire that rapidly without mechanical failure." "Thank you, sir," Rebecca replied, maintaining composure despite her internal tension. "Regular maintenance is key." "Indeed," the general studied her thoughtfully. "You know, this reminds me of something I heard about during the Korean War. There was an artillery unit at Busan that modified their guns to fire at nearly double capacity during a critical defensive action. Saved a lot of lives." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. Her grandfather had been at Busan. "I've heard similar stories, sir," she managed to reply neutrally. "Those artillery pieces were destroyed afterward, of course," the general continued. "The modifications put too much stress on the systems for long-term use, but in that situation it was the right call." He turned to Colonel Hayes. "Colonel, I'm impressed with what I've seen here. While the General Dynamics system has obvious advantages for specialized applications, I'm not convinced we need to replace our entire inventory of M121s if they can perform at the levels demonstrated today." Hayes looked like he was trying not to smile too broadly. "Thank you, sir. We believe with proper maintenance and training, our existing systems can meet operational requirements effectively." "I'll want a detailed report on your maintenance protocols," Westmoreland added, glancing at Rebecca. If we can achieve this performance across the force, it could save hundreds of millions in acquisition costs. Of course, sir, Hayes agreed. Sergeant Chen will provide all the necessary documentation. As the general moved away to speak with other officers, Hayes turned to Rebecca, his expression now showing concern. He wants documentation, Sergeant. Care to tell me what we'll be documenting? Rebecca took a deep breath. Sir, I made some modifications to the recoil and cooling systems. Technically, they're not approved in the maintenance manuals, but they're based on proven techniques that have been used in combat situations. Hayes lowered his voice. Let me guess, these techniques aren't something we can officially admit to using. Not under current regulations, sir. Hayes considered this for a moment. The general's no fool, Chen. I think he suspects what you did. That story about Korea wasn't coincidental. Rebecca nodded. Her grandfather's modifications hadn't been officially recognized, but stories had circulated among artillery units for years. Here's what we're going to do, Hayes decided. You're going to document a version of your maintenance procedures that emphasizes thoroughness, attention to detail, and optimal tuning within approved parameters. Nothing about unauthorized modifications. And the mortars, sir. Return them to standard configuration before the next inspection, but make sure they can be enhanced again if needed for operational deployment. Rebecca understood. The Army would maintain plausible deniability while benefiting from her grandfather's forbidden techniques. One more thing, Hayes added. General Westmoreland mentioned a special technical advisory role opening up with the RDTF. He asked if I had anyone to recommend. I'm putting your name forward. Rebecca struggled to mask her surprise. The RDTF technical advisory position was prestigious, working directly with elite units to optimize their equipment for special operations. Thank you, sir. As Hayes walked away, Jackson approached. So, are we being court-martialed or what? Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. Not today, but we've got some late nights ahead, returning these systems to standard configuration while documenting our official maintenance procedures. Jackson grinned. Worth it. Did you see the faces of those General Dynamics guys? They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Rebecca's gaze drifted to where the mortar crews were securing the systems for transport back to the maintenance bay. Her grandfather's techniques, his forbidden tricks, had just saved a program and potentially given American soldiers more effective fire support without waiting years for new equipment. My grandfather would have enjoyed that, she said quietly. Think we should tell him how it went. Rebecca hadn't told Jackson that her grandfather had passed away 3 years earlier. His tools and techniques were her inheritance, her responsibility now. He already knows, she replied. Come on, we've got work to do. 6 months after the demonstration at Fort Sill, Technical Sergeant Rebecca Chen found herself in a very different environment. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan stretched around her, jagged peaks disappearing into low clouds as dawn broke over forward operating Base Condor. As the RDTF's newly appointed Ordnance Technical Advisor, Rebecca had spent the past months traveling between forward deployments, working directly with elite units to optimize their equipment for the specific challenges they faced. Today, she was conducting final checks on a 4-gun mortar battery positioned on the FOB's perimeter. The M121 mortars, subtly modified using her grandfather's techniques, were a critical defensive element for this isolated outpost. Morning, Sergeant Chen, Captain Marcus Reed greeted her as he approached the mortar position. As the base commander, Reed had welcomed Rebecca's expertise, especially after hearing about her reputation from the demonstration at Fort Sill. How are our guns today? In excellent condition, sir, Rebecca replied, closing the access panel she'd been inspecting. The crews have maintained them well even with the rough conditions up here. Reed nodded approvingly. Good to hear. Intel suggests increased activity in the valley. We might need these sooner rather than later. Rebecca had been at FOB Condor for just under a week, enough time to implement her modifications on all 4 mortar systems and train the crews on optimal firing techniques. The high altitude and extreme temperature variations of the Afghan mountains created unique challenges for mortar operations, challenges her grandfather's methods helped address. We'll be ready if needed, sir, she assured the captain. After Reed departed, Rebecca continued her work, making final adjustments to each mortar. Specialist Tors, one of the local mortar crew members who had been assisting her, watched with interest. "So these really fired twice their normal rate back at Fort Sill?" he asked quietly, handing her a specialized tool from her grandfather's kit. "They did," Rebecca confirmed. Word of the demonstration had spread through the artillery community, growing with each telling until it had become almost legendary. But remember, it's not just about firing rate. It's about reliability under stress and in extreme conditions. Tors nodded seriously. "Like up here, the cold nights, hot days, dust everywhere, standard systems struggle." "Exactly." Rebecca tightened a final connection. "These modifications help the mortars adapt to these conditions. They'll fire more consistently and handle rapid fire better if you need it." "If we need it," Tors repeated, glancing toward the valley below. "Way intelligence has been talking, it's more like when." Rebecca followed his gaze. Fob Condor occupied a strategic position overlooking a key transit route used by insurgent forces. For the past month, intelligence had tracked increasing enemy movement, suggesting a possible coordinated attack. Before she could respond, the base's alert system blared to life. "All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel to defensive positions." Rebecca and Tors exchanged glances before rushing to complete their final preparations. Around them, the fob erupted into organized chaos as soldiers moved to their assigned posts. Captain Reed's voice came over Rebecca's radio. "Chen, get to the command post. We need your expertise on the fire support plan." At the command post, a reinforced bunker near the center of the fob, Reed was studying a tactical display with his senior officers. He waved Rebecca over as she entered. "Intelligence confirms multiple enemy groups converging on our position from 3 directions," Reed explained, pointing to the map. "At least 200 fighters, possibly more, with heavy weapons." Rebecca studied the terrain. "The mortars can cover approaches 1 and 2 effectively," she noted. "Approach 3 has too much dead ground due to the ridge." "That's where our machine gun emplacements are concentrated," Reed confirmed. "But our primary concern is this." He indicated a cluster of red markers in a village about 2 kilometers from the base. "Intelligence believes they've positioned multiple heavy weapons there, recoilless rifles, possibly even a few mortars of their own." Rebecca immediately grasped the problem. "They'll target our defensive positions while their main force approaches. If they get those weapons firing effectively, they could suppress our defenses enough to get assault teams close to the perimeter." "Exactly. We need to neutralize those positions quickly." "Air support?" Rebecca asked. Reed shook his head grimly. "Nearest air assets are 20 minutes out at best. Weather's deteriorating, too. Those clouds are dropping. We might lose air support entirely if the ceiling gets too low." The implications were clear. The mortar battery would be their primary means of striking the enemy's heavy weapons before they could become effective. "How quickly can you register fires on those positions?" Reed asked. Rebecca conferred briefly with the fire direction controller. "We can have initial targeting data in 5 minutes, adjust after the first round's impact." "Do it," Reed ordered. "Priority is their heavy weapons. We need to knock those out fast." As Rebecca moved to join the mortar teams, Reed stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "Chen, I know about your modifications to the mortars. Word gets around." His expression was deadly serious. "If there was ever a time to push those systems to their limits, it's now." Rebecca nodded. "Understood, sir." Outside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy fighters had appeared on the ridgelines, and the first probing fire was hitting the fob's outer defenses. Rebecca reached the mortar position as the crews were preparing for action. "Listen up," she addressed the 4 mortar teams. "We need to suppress enemy heavy weapons in the village, grid coordinates to follow. These are priority targets that need to be neutralized immediately." She paused, making eye contact with each crew leader. "We'll be firing at maximum rate. The systems are modified to handle it, but you need to be precise in your movements." The crews nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Rebecca had trained them on the specialized techniques required to operate the modified mortars safely at enhanced rates of fire. "Fire direction has your targets," she continued. "On their command, I want maximum sustained fire until those positions are neutralized." From the command post, the fire direction controller began transmitting targeting data. The mortar crews worked with practiced efficiency, adjusting their weapons to the proper elevation and deflection. "Battery fire," came the command. The first salvo of rounds arced skyward with a distinctive thump. Rebecca watched through binoculars as they impacted near the village, slightly off target but close enough for adjustment. "Adjust fire, drop 50, right 25, the spotter called. The next salvo struck directly among the enemy positions. Through her binoculars, Rebecca could see secondary explosions as ammunition was hit. "Target bracketed, fire for effect." This was the critical moment. Under normal protocols, the mortars would fire at their standard rate of 4 rounds per minute, too slow to neutralize the enemy positions before they could cause significant damage to the FOB's defenses. "Maximum sustained fire," Rebecca ordered. The mortar crews responded immediately, shifting into the enhanced firing procedure she had taught them. Rounds flew from the tubes at more than twice the standard rate, 9 rounds per minute from each mortar, a near-continuous stream of high explosive raining down on the enemy positions. Rebecca moved between the mortars, monitoring their performance. The modified recoil systems were handling the stress beautifully, and the specialized cooling rings prevented the barrels from overheating despite the punishing rate of fire. From her radio, she could hear the reports from the FOB's observers. Direct hits on enemy positions, heavy weapons suppressed, enemy forces taking cover. For 15 minutes, the mortars maintained their extraordinary rate of fire, more than 500 rounds delivered with devastating accuracy. Under normal circumstances, such extended rapid fire would have rendered the mortar systems inoperable from overheating and mechanical stress. But Rebecca's modifications, her grandfather's forbidden techniques, kept them functioning flawlessly. "Enemy heavy weapons neutralized," came the report from the command post. "Main enemy force retreating from approaches 1 and 2. The mortar crews cheered, but Rebecca remained focused, checking each system for signs of stress damage. They were hot, hotter than normal operations would allow, but still within the parameters her modifications had created. Captain Reed's voice came over her radio. "Outstanding work, Chen. Your mortars just saved this base from being overrun." The fighting continued for another hour, but without their heavy weapons support, the enemy attack lost momentum and eventually broke off entirely. By mid-afternoon, FOB Condor was secure, having suffered only minor damage and a few wounded personnel. As the all-clear was sounded, Rebecca supervised the mortar crews in cooling down and servicing their weapons. Despite firing more than 125 rounds per tube, at a rate that should have been impossible according to the technical manuals, all 4 mortars remained operational. Captain Reed joined her as she completed her inspection. "I've been in the Army 18 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen mortars fire like that, not even close. By all rights, these tubes should be burned out and useless." Rebecca ran her hand along one of the barrels, feeling the unique properties of the metal beneath her fingers. "My grandfather used to say that equipment has limits, but those limits aren't always what the manual says they are." "Your grandfather was a wise man." Reed looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, I've put in a request for those General Dynamics prototype mortars for our next rotation. After today, I'm withdrawing that request." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Sir, why spend millions on new systems when what we have works this well?" Reed shrugged. "I'm recommending instead that all our mortar teams receive what I'm calling enhanced maintenance training, specifically training from you." Later that evening, as Rebecca sat outside her quarters watching the sunset over the Afghan mountains, she took out the worn photograph of her grandfather standing beside his artillery piece in Korea. She'd carried it with her through every deployment, a reminder of his legacy. Today, that legacy had saved lives, American lives, just as it had 70 years earlier in a different war on a different continent. 2 weeks later, Rebecca received orders that would change the course of her career. She was being reassigned to Fort Sill, not as a maintenance technician this time, but as an instructor for a new, specialized course. Advanced Field Modifications for Combat Conditions. The course description was carefully worded to avoid explicit mention of unauthorized modifications, but Rebecca understood the meaning behind the bureaucratic language. The Army had found a way to formally incorporate her grandfather's forbidden techniques into official training, without actually admitting they were bending their own rules. Colonel Hayes had championed the program, backed by General Westmoreland after the successful demonstration and further validated by the action at Fob Condor, which had already become a case study in effective fire support. On her last day in Afghanistan, Rebecca received a package from the States. Inside was a letter from her mother, along with a small wooden box she recognized immediately, her grandfather's personal toolbox. The letter explained that her mother had found additional specialized tools and notes in her grandfather's workshop, which she thought Rebecca might need for her new assignment. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note in her grandfather's distinctive script, apparently written years earlier and saved for this moment. Rebecca, there are two kinds of rules in this world, those that exist to maintain order and those that exist to maintain life. When they conflict, always choose life. The tools in this box aren't just metal, they're wisdom born from necessity. Use them well, teach others, and remember that sometimes the forbidden path is the right one. With pride, Grandfather. As she packed for her return to Fort Sill, Rebecca carefully stowed both the old tools she'd carried for years and the new ones her mother had sent. Her grandfather's forbidden tricks had come full circle, from unauthorized field modifications in the Korean War to saving lives in Afghanistan to, finally, becoming part of the Army's official training doctrine. Some rules were meant to be broken, especially when lives hung in the balance. Her grandfather had understood that, and now, thanks to her, the Army was beginning to understand it too. The techniques wouldn't appear in any official manual. They would be passed from instructor to student, from veteran to novice, in the time-honored tradition of soldiers teaching each other the real ways of war. The knowledge that exists beyond the regulations but proves its worth when bullets fly and lives are on the line. Rebecca Chen, once viewed with skepticism for being different, had turned her grandfather's legacy into a gift for the entire Army. And somewhere, she knew, her grandfather was smiling with pride. The forbidden trick that made mortars fire at twice their rated capacity hadn't just saved a base in Afghanistan. It had changed the way an institution thought about innovation, necessity, and the wisdom that sometimes comes from breaking the rules for all the right reasons.